we at, Arch?
Comic-Con, Chicago.
Really? So how's it going so far?
Chaotic, but awesome.
Or do you think that it's kind of a simultaneous effect, where someone publishes it and illustrates it and puts it in the pop culture, but at the same time that's already being worked on?
It's both. Yes, exactly. It's both. What pop culture does, it can steer people into different directions. It's been well documented that the space program for was directly influenced by 2001.
How all this starts to come together, how pop culture becomes a visual language. Well, you can study the part of semiotics, which sounds really boring just to say the word, but it's a process. It's understanding sign interpretation. Mythology is very important as well. Superheroes. This is our mythology. These are our Roman gods. You look at Superman and Batman and Spider-Man, they have moral dilemmas. They're who we look up to. There are Zeus, there are Apollo. And in many ways, how we convey the principles of our society is channeled through the dilemmas that these superheroes face. And art and culture, in many ways, and it's something this is a very strange way to look at it, it's kind of like warfare. It's been well documented that they sent Walt Disney down to South America in the 1940s to sort of win over countries that were sort of leaning towards communism. And our government kind of figured, well, this is a really great tool, especially when we were in the Cold War. So there's a reason why Jackson Pollock and Lichtenstein and all these people were, there's a reason why they ended up on Life magazine. There has been a lot of discussion that, in many ways, I don't know if it was directly CIA or if it was government, they were kind of leading the charge, if you will, because especially in Europe, where countries were sort of wavering, it really was important to show America as a sort of cultural mecca. It had to happen. It was a way to beat the Russians, because the Russians were boring, and they were cold, and the only thing cool that came out of it was Ivan Drago. And that was an American invention anyway. You could really live those ways. Now, originally I was going to show this awesome slide of a piece of pop art. It was considered the first pop art, but that's okay. We won't worry about this. You guys just relax. It's okay. Although it is kind of interesting. It's kind of pop art. It's fun. Just What Is It That Makes Today's Home So Different, So Appealing by Richard Hamilton in 1956. He had done a piece of basically, it was considered the first pop art. And in the collage that was used for the exhibition of This Is Tomorrow in London, it started to show that pop culture could be used as a way to transmit information. It was basically cut in pieces. There's an egg guy, there's a Tootsie Pop, there's a girl, there's all these wonderful products. And we started to realize we were starting to spin in and upon itself. The onslaught of mass media. The thing is first we have to look at the medium and how which all this comes and attacks us. First, you started with photography, and then cinema, comics, later television, video, and the internet. And the history of all mass media has been marked by confrontations between those who are really enthusiastic about this new technology, and they're the trendsetters. They're the ones that go into it and are like, oh yeah, we can make something beautiful out of this. And then, of course, there's always the naysayers who say, you know what, this really isn't art. This really isn't true. Video games are experiencing this right now. We don't consider video games to be true art form, but it's going to happen. We forget that in the history of cinema, in the silent film era, movies were considered a novelty. It wasn't until they started talking, then we started taking them seriously, and then they became the art form of the 20th century. Now, at some point, video games are going to listen. And what I mean by that is you're going to go in and you're going to see some kid playing a video game. He's going to be talking to a character, like in Mass Effect 5.
Yeah.
And depending on how this person talks, like, please, no, we have to go. The dragon's coming. It's going to eat your head. We have to leave. If you're convincing enough, you will get the character to actually do something. Once video games become interactive, It will be an art form for the 21st century. And yeah, they've been around for 30 years, but we forget how long silent films are for. Oh, wow. Here we go. Yeah, I'll just do a quick skim through here. You can't see that, but that's really cool. This is just some examples of sort of like the cross-pollination of pop culture now in the 21st century. We have Katniss Everdeen in a Obama poster. We have Community done as Peanuts, and then we have Family Guy done as Star Wars. More on that in a bit. The biggest mistake that we make, and the reason why we have underestimated that pop culture could have such a thorough influence on our world, is that because we don't really know how to frame it. Human beings are bad at a couple things. One, we're really bad at risk assessment, but we're also bad at scale assessment as well. It's the reason why we're all on Prozac is because we watch news and we see all this stuff blowing up. We don't realize it's not happening in our backyard, it's happening all around the world. But we're still trying to figure out and determine how this actually, what this actually means. Our brains are starting to wrap its way around it. And part of the reason why is because we always say that television changed the world or internet changed the world. But it's not television that changes the world. It's not internet. It's the content that changes the world. It's like saying the gun shot somebody or the car won the race. No, the gun helps, quoting Eddie Izzard, and mechanics behind the car definitely help, but it is still a human person. It is the content. It is the driver. It is the shooter. It is the person who is behind the technology that changes the world. And because we sort of underestimate, we underestimate the impact that television had on our society. And I like to, we'll do another movie quote here. It's the famous line of Ian Malcolm in Jurassic Park where he says, your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should. Well, people will never think if they should, for the most part. Sometimes we do, but for the most part we like to release things and see how we react to it. So part of the reason why I think pop culture could be a very interesting sort of background for 21st century American culture is that it does sort of give you context. It gives you almost a moral context in a way. It lets you think about very complex and sophisticated ideas very, very quickly before we start unleashing things out into the world. In the early days, when mass media started to become a real phenomenon, especially television, when stories and tales could be presented electronically, and we weren't limited by the constraints of live performance, we could see dynamic shifts in mass global behavior. People were fascinated with synthetic communities built by virtual theater. And we cared more about I Love Lucy than we did our own neighbors. Now, a lot of people like to say this is a bad thing, but I'll quote my great uncle Bob, who said that it was better because we left each other the hell alone. And he might have a point there, actually. And we'll get to that in a little bit, too. So to understand how pop culture becomes a language, we're going to briefly look at the cycle. You have conceived mediated reality and perceived mediated reality. Conceived mediated reality is the programming and stories and universes created by those in the media elite, using the tools that they have. And perceived mediated reality is basically how we look, how we understand. And maybe, you know what, I'm just going to put this slide up here right now. There's a warning for anyone who's seen Network 1977. Soon the television will be telling you what to do. Well, it did happen. But what's interesting is that once we experience the content of television, of movies, of music, we change our behavior. And in turn, the people who create the media change their behavior. And it becomes a cycle. A perfect example of this was back in the days of the Dick Van Dyke Show, which I'm sure you all remember. And we forget that there was this big problem. Television was new, and they just really felt weird about showing a married couple in the same bed. So what did they do? They had two separate beds. For those who've seen Pleasantville, you'll know what I'm talking about. And it was even another law that said that you actually had to have one foot on the floor at all times. What was so fascinating about this is that people kind of liked the idea, especially if your husband snored a lot. And it was before long that there was an actual fad where people were buying double beds for themselves. And thus the birth of As Seen on TV. Now, as we move along to getting to sort of the hyper media that we experience, we're just going to go ahead and skip through the 60s, 70s, and 80s because nothing happened there. I know, but in all honesty, there's nothing about the 60s that hasn't been said already that I cannot say. And the one thing I'll just indicate about the 70s and 80s is that during the rise of the blockbuster, George Lucas and Steven Spielberg took, obviously Star Wars and Indiana Jones, and they were based upon the old serials from the 1930s and 1940s, Buck Rogers and Saturday Matinee Adventures. But what was interesting was that I didn't have to know Buck Rogers to appreciate Star Wars. I could appreciate Star Wars as an entity of its own. That starts to change in the 90s, because in the 90s mass media sort of goes into that conceived and mediated reality, perceived and mediated reality. It goes into hyperdrive, and it falls in love with itself. So getting into like 1994, we're treated to like 3 game-changing films, and we're all very familiar with these: Pulp Fiction, Forrest Gump, and Clerks. This was modern cinema. This was hyperlinked cinema a year before the internet was actually going to happen. As we all know, that Forrest is a character that lives and breathes human history. And it was a film that, if you were in another country, you didn't quite get it. I remember reading reviews. It was like, England's like, yeah, it's all right, yeah. They thought it was interesting, but you kind of had to have American history in your brain in order to understand the film. Pulp Fiction, the world, it lives in Americana. I mean, they live in a world of burger joints and of gangsters. And although you don't have to necessarily know specifics about American history, you understand and appreciate the movie better if you understand the world in which it's living in. And what Clerks did, besides doing a lot of pop culture referencing, everyone knows the famous Death Star and government contractor speech. But it was also done at such a small budget, and we kind of forget that, in our YouTube era, the idea of doing a small independent film, and for those who are older, yes, we're that old. It's been almost 20 years. That, the reason why the movie's black and white is because they couldn't afford to change the bulbs. You have to actually have special fluorescent lighting that wouldn't tint the color film, so it was actually cheaper to do it in black and white. That's how old that movie is. That's how old I am, anyway. That's what we did in college, was those 3 movies. But it also showed that anybody with a good idea can make a film. And in some ways, at least we can look at the myth of it, paved the way for what we have today in our Memento, Inception world. Because as we all know, Pulp Fiction cracked linear storytelling. It just doesn't happen. I mean, it's way more interesting to tell movies out of sequence. And in some ways, the meaning and the way a movie affects us is so much more enhanced by that simple technique. I do remember too that people were so thrown off by Pulp Fiction. They didn't understand, how is he alive again? He was shot. He was a little shot. How did he come back? Gotta watch the movie. Now, in television in the 90s, where shows like The Simpsons weren't limited by the laws of physics, they immediately, you could almost say they created the art of pop culture literacy. Simpsons were hilarious, but you can right now watch a supercut of all the movie references that were made in The Simpsons in the first 10 seasons, and it goes on for about 40 minutes. It is literally laced. It is embedded with movie. It is embedded with movie metaphors. I mean, it's funny to see Homer Simpson roll down the stairway, emulating the scene from Raiders of the Lost Ark. He's like, and Bart's running away with the trophy. It's even funnier if you've seen Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Yeah.
And as we know, Hi, Clerks. There you are, in front of the video store. How ironic. Which is another 90s term for those who were around. On the other side, like Beavis and Butthead and shows like Mystery Science Theater 3000. And those shows were built upon making fun of other shows or music videos or movies. It was the first time that we started to remove ourselves from the actual narrative. We became the guy behind the guy behind the guy. We were watching other people watching shows, which further enhanced what we refer to as narrative collapse. And the idea is that you don't have to tell stories linearly anymore. Pop culture takes on a life of its own. It becomes self-referencing. It becomes meta. Even like, obviously, if you go to The Simpsons, you gotta go to The Family Guy. Here's a show that basically they do these like irrelevant gags that have absolutely nothing to do with moving the story forward. And all the time it's cutting to like these different things, aha video, this and that. And we think that's actually that's a huge break in how we do storytelling. They always tell you in storytelling class, whatever you put into it, it has to move the story forward. Family Guy is always moving the story in 100 different directions. And of course, if you look at getting into pop culture literacy, there's some exciting stuff going on here. I'm going to check it out. Here's for example, The Simpsons referencing the Sopranos. But like, I'm sure you've all seen the Family Guy Star Wars episodes. There's a great scene when they were doing Empire Strikes Back, where Peter goes up and he's like, "Hey, is that the Purina logo?" And he's like, "No, it's just a badge." He's like, "Oh, for anybody who remembers that movie very thoroughly, I remember as a kid thinking, why is he wearing the Purina logo? It makes no sense. Gags like that, you have to have intimate knowledge of what it's based upon. Because if you do, you really do start to get the gag. Let's see here, how do you... there we go. We'll get to this in a minute. Obviously in the 2000s, shows increased in sophistication. Shows like Community, where it's basically a extremely hyperactive, self-aware sitcom that plays every week. It kind of spoofs its own tropes, the own things it's locked upon. And then you have shows like Lost, which basically need its own Wikipedia to understand what's going on. And quite honestly, I still don't know what happened. I mean, they died, right? Or did they live? I have no clue. It was a great show, but it made no sense to me. See, the world, one thing we always have to remember about the world of popular culture is that it's a highly romantic one, in the true sense of the word. It is an emotionally idealized experience that we allow ourselves to be persuaded and in some cases manipulated by. But that's the key. See, we have to allow ourselves to let pop culture come in and to understand it. But we can't know that we're being manipulated. We can't know that we're being sweet-talked. And here's a perfect example. In '97, when U2 did their Pop Mart tour, they always said, you know what, it was because the album wasn't ready yet. That's why it wasn't as good as it could have been. No, actually, it's because nobody likes to know they're being sold to. That's the key to selling, is they can't know they're being sold. When you do a whole entire concert, it's basically like, I read commercials and it's funny. It doesn't get people as excited as they can be. I thought it was great. I mean, I'm an artist guy, so I'm like, look at them making fun of all of this. This is so cool. But, it did, didn't go over very well, and they did other things. So getting back into movie quotes. A friend of mine was dating another friend they're both in their 50s, and he had, and I just be ready for this, had not seen It's a Wonderful Life. I know, right? I mean, how does that possibly happen? He had not seen it, so she showed him It's a Wonderful Life. And he was stunned, he was amazed. He couldn't believe that there were so many lines, so many things that he had heard and seen that came from this movie. And it's a true phenomenon. I mean, we look at it like, for anybody who's seen the Bunny's version of it, in 30 seconds they take all the great lines of the film and they condense it for you and then you're set to go. And in some strange ways you've actually feel like you've seen the film. That is a very different way of processing information. We can process information based upon information we've already processed. It's really, really fascinating. Now where's all this going, you're wondering? We'll get to that. This is all the setup, this is all the big excitement. Getting back into movie quotes. Now, we were saying that you guys everyone likes to quote certain films. They like to quote certain things. For the quotes, and we'll ask everyone real quick, when you quote a film, when do you do it? When do you find yourself, anyone want to answer this? When do you find yourself quoting a movie? Do you just blurt it out, in the middle, just because? Is it an uncomfortable silence? Does anyone want to answer this? I'm going to put context. Very good. Yeah?
Driving in the car, coming here, my daughter sees something on the side. Oh, we saw a tractor. We saw a tractor going on this big thing, the rubble. And I looked at it and I'm like, ooh, that's good. That's really cool. And my son says, Mom, that's totally barbaric. That's Hermione Granger.
Yeah.
Looking at, wizard chess. And my husband says, no, that's not the right quote there, babe. I said, no, it's Ron Weasley's quote of that's wicked. We quote a lot of Harry Potter.
Yeah, I got
But
you.
it's appropriate because not just wow is sufficient. It's got to be more.
No, exactly. No, I agree. And it's interesting, my wife and I, because we quote movies all the time, we actually decided to do a game. And this is a fun game you guys can do tonight, is add up all the movies you quote. By the way, this is just the first part. This is what we came up with in the first 5 minutes.
Oh, man.
We actually added about 65 movie quotes within the first hour, and within a couple hours and a few wine glasses later, we came up with 120. Strange, too, we started actually analyzing this, and then we started doing some research on this. Why pop culture becomes extremely useful in society. Here's one of the videos, anyway. Is that besides the fact that in context, you can say something and it has a hell of a lot more meaning than just saying something. There's a perfect example, like one we quote all the time, and the quotes that we quote a lot of times, they're not even like the big quotes, you know. Like I always quote like "someone's in a hurry" from like Casino Royale. It's that little scene where the sheep, he's got his eyes, he's all sitting like, "Come on, sir, let's play the game." And every time someone's like speeding by us, as happens in Chicago very frequently, at about 130 miles per hour, we're like, "Someone's in a hurry." It's a way for Jay and I to sort of joke and kind of laugh. And it's sort of a fun situation. It comes in really handy when you're in a crowd too. Like, a lot of times you're just sitting there in line, and there's always that guy just staring at you. Yeah. You know what I'm talking about, right? There's always just somebody just decides they're just going to stare at you, right? And they're just close enough to where if you say something about it, they're going to hear you, and they look like they might have a weapon on them. And so you kind of just will turn to each other and say, "I like Santa. I like the Wizard of Oz. I like the Tin Man." And immediately, we totally know we're on the same page. And we don't have to worry about being murdered. And that's